Did you know that sand can sing? All right, rather hum. Incidentally, this is what happens when many grains of sand collide in a dune. But that's not why we're making a movie about sand.
Sand is the second most used resource on Earth after fresh water and is therefore a megastar.
And which is everywhere. Without it, there wouldn't be this, or this, or this.
Without sand, we are lost, basically.
In the last 20 years, sand consumption has tripled. And this doesn't just destroy the environment.
People are losing lives based on this resource that so many of us take for granted.
Is sand not an endless resource? Do we have to protect it from us? Let's be honest, how are we ever going to use up all the grains of sand in the world? There are more grains on Earth than we can see stars twinkling. At least that's what a German physics teacher has calculated. There are said to be 70 trillion grains of sand in the Sahara alone, a 7 with 22 zeros. And it's not just there, but in almost every crack, just like sand by the sea.
We don't think about the dependency that we have on this material. It's absolutely everywhere, and it's funny because we don't realize that. It's very surprising.
Where exactly is it, if it's everywhere, this sand?
We wake up in the morning, we brush our teeth. The white pigment that is in that toothpaste is likely to be titanium dioxide. It's a derivative of sand. You open the tap, right, the faucet, and the water that rushes out, it's likely that sand was used to purify that water. The tap itself might have been manufactured in a foundry which used a system called sand casting.
Or in the office, the Post-it, the sticky side coated with sand. Monitors, cables, microchips, table coatings, none of this would exist without sand. Or, more precisely, silicon. Paper for printing. Sand is often used for production. No glass without sand, no wine without sand. Sand is used as an anti-caking agent. In some salt or grated cheese, for example. And the waistband of underpants contains silicon, a sand product. But most of the grains trickle elsewhere.
Our society are literally built on sand. We use sand and gravels mixed with cement to make concrete, and concrete is for all infrastructures, bridges, tunnels, hospitals, schools.
And it's not just people who build with sand.
Biology also uses sand in the same way. There are organisms that build their shells out of sand, such as the sand tubeworm. Where do crocodiles lay their eggs? Where do sea turtles lay their eggs? They lay their eggs in the sand, and they are hatched there. And in this respect, it really is the hero, because it can be used in all areas of life.
As is the case with resources which seem to be plentiful. Life, and not just ours, adapts itself to them and becomes fatally dependent.
We are using every day about 17 kilograms, every single individual. So we are using 50 billion tons of sand per year. To give an idea, it's enough material to build a wall of 27 meter high, 27 meter wide, all around the equator every year.
In other words, around 40,000 kilometers of wall. And this wall is growing because our consumption is increasing. Over 80% of the sand we use ends up in the concrete mixer. A standard detached house contains around 200 tons of sand. A hospital contains around 3,000 tons. Every kilometer of freeway eats up 30,000 tons of sand. Concrete is cheap. Fast-growing cities in Asia and Africa in particular consume vast quantities of sand.
There are figures showing that China consumed as much cement, and therefore concrete, in 3 years at the beginning of the 2000s as the USA did in the entire 20th century, calculated over 100 years.
70 to 80% of all buildings worldwide are made of reinforced concrete and therefore sand. However, its grains are also needed for bricks, mortar and plaster. Its triumph as a building material began early on. The Romans invented concrete in ancient times. They used it to build houses and bathhouses, and the foundations of the Colosseum. Sand was also used, on and off, for window glass and became increasingly a driving force in research. Binoculars and microscopes making it possible to discover the world in a whole new way. But for a long time, glass was a luxury and concrete was not a commodity. This only changed at the beginning of the 20th century.
Sand has been part of humanity and the question of how we live on this planet from the very start. Every mud hut was made of sand. Clay is also a mixture of clay and sand. This means that life without sand wouldn't have been possible.
And why should it? Of course, everything has its limits, but even sand?
Sand is definitely not an endless resource, not in human timescales.
Are we all talking about the same sand? What is sand anyway?
Sand is nothing more than a weathering product. Or let me put it more simply, sand is nothing more than the name for a grain size.
Sand is therefore a type of material. It can consist of various minerals. But it is above all its external composition that makes it so indispensable. And this has to do with its biography, because the size of the grain determines whether it is called sand at all. Let's take this grain of sand. Let's call it sandy. Sandy was part of a rock. Over time, wind, rain, freeze-thaw cycles, or microorganisms removed rock. It weathered, crumbled, and made its way down into the valley via glaciers, streams, or wind. Sandy became smaller, bumped into other grains, became even smaller. For a while, sandy remained in the riverbed, covered in sediment, but eventually it moved further and further until the grain reached a river delta or the sea.
It ranges from very fine, 0.063 millimeters, and the coarsest sand we have is already millimeters in diameter. That's a coarse grain, which you can also see clearly. So all of this is sand. When it gets even finer, it becomes silt, and when even finer, and many people know this, it becomes clay.
Sand comes from different rocks. This black beach on Lanzarote is made of volcanic rock. Most grains of sand on Earth are made of quartz, the most common material in the Earth's crust. Quartz grains can be found in rivers, in the desert, or on the beaches of the Baltic or North Sea. But sandy beaches can also be made from crushed coral, skeletons, and shells. And this sand in Hawaii is made of, well, feces. The parrotfish is the sand factory, so to speak. With its teeth, which resemble a parrot's beak, it grazes coral reefs and excretes the sediment that it crushes in the process. A large parrotfish produces up to 300 kilograms of sand per year. No matter which sand it is, the composition of the minerals or even its surface tell us its long history. This sand on Kiel's Baltic Sea beach, for example, was transported here by glaciers during the last ice age.
What we mustn't forget about the transportation route is that it's not continuous. From being processed to getting transported in one continuous line like a train, starting at one point and then arriving at its destination at another point. That's not the case with sand. In some cases, we have sands that have been lying in the same place for millions of years, and we're continuously consuming more sand than is being produced.
That would mean we are turning sand into an endangered species?
The way we have set up society, we can consume these resources in a matter of decades. If you think in terms of a bank account, if you increase your expenditure several fold, that stock that we have can get depleted really fast.
Wait a minute, we consume an estimated 50 billion tons a year. The physics teacher who calculated that there are more grains of sand than stars also calculated how many tons of sand there are in the Sahara. He counted grains of sand for 3 hours until he reached 1,000. Weighed them and calculated that Saharan sand weighs around 130 trillion tons. But the largest sand desert is called Rub al-Khali. It is located in southern Arabia and is more than twice the size of Germany. Shouldn't the sand in the deserts last longer?
I think one of the popular reactions I get is like, oh, there's plenty of sand in the Sahara. Not all sand is equal.
It varies in size, texture, and purity. High-purity quartz sand is needed for computer chips or solar cells because it contains a lot of silicon in the form of silicon dioxide. And what about the sand that is required for building?
So here we have our construction sand with a very broad spectrum. This means that we have large grains and small grains, and the surface is somewhat rough. And we have our desert sand here, a smooth grain surface. The grain spectrum is not so broad.
In other words, grains of the same size and shape that have been abraded by the wind.
We take our desert sand. It rolls apart in all directions. We take our building sand. And we see that the grains really hold together because the surfaces are rougher and because we have the smaller grains between the coarser ones, which further stabilize the whole structure.
And that is what makes concrete so strong. This means that not every sand is suitable for every purpose, and desert sand is not suitable for building. So how do we satisfy our hunger for sand?
How do we get to the sand? We have groundwater protection areas. We have nature conservation areas. We have military training areas, which means that we can't get to many of the sand deposits we have. In Europe, we have socially agreed not to take the last grain of sand out of the ground.
In Germany, for example, only a third of the sand deposits are therefore usable. As a result, there are shortages in some regions, which is why sand has to be imported.
So we think we still have a lot, but in many places it is going down. And quite quickly. Not even going in developing countries. If you look at Belgium, they've done their assessment. They look at the North Sea sand, and at current extraction rate, they've got another 80 years to go, which may seem long, but if you are in charge of a country, 80 years is not that long.
The availability of sand depends on the geology of a region. However, this alone does not determine whether there are problems.
You could pick a point on the map and you'd find that if the place is growing rapidly, then yes, it requires sand. Now, the question is, where is it coming from? Is it being done in a manner that is equitable, that is sustainable?
This depends heavily on the legislation and environmental protection of the country in question. But no matter where sand is mined, it always means interfering with an ecosystem. This can sometimes be more or less harmful.
If you take it from rivers, the sand is playing an important role in regulating the river flow, as well as supporting local fauna like fishes, crabs, birds. So if you remove sand, you will have difference in river flows. It can go faster or slower, leading to floods or droughts, leading to riverbanks erosion.
Such as in Southeast Asia. India, Vietnam, Cambodia, and China have grown rapidly over the past decade. This has not only swallowed up a lot of sand, but above all has had consequences for the places from which the sand originates. River systems, such as the Mekong in Vietnam, a particularly densely populated and fertile habitat.
It is already sinking for two reasons, because of sea level rise, secondly because of withdrawal of the water. But on top of that, The amount of sand that has been extracted from the Mekong River is absolutely tremendous. And that has changed the shape of the Mekong, and that's creating a lot of problems.
When barges use gigantic pumps to remove huge quantities of sand from the riverbeds, riverbanks and settlements can collapse into the water. Fields, fish ponds, stores and homes can lose their footing and bridges can be washed away. The riverbeds are sinking, so deep in fact that salt water from the sea flows up to 100 kilometers inland, which jeopardizes the freshwater supply, and with it the livelihoods of millions of people and animals.
And when we talk about future problems, we're not talking about hundreds of years. We're talking about years or decades. They will arise in the large delta regions where millions of people live.
Once a delta has sunk, it cannot simply be pumped up again. On the other hand, the riverbed would have to come back at some point, because the processes that create sand also remain. In fact, there should be more and more sand, shouldn't there?
We have over 850,000 dams across the world that block the flow of rivers, right? And when they block water, they also block sand. We're changing the way the sand cycle works in the world, and we're only beginning to find out what does this entail.
If the cycles of natural sand production are disrupted and sand sources do not replenish themselves, there is really only one thing to do: find new sources.
Extraction of marine sand requires large vessels. Those vessels are extremely efficient in extracting sand from the bottom of the sea. They're like giant vacuum cleaner. So we see now, because we have exhausted the easy access in the quarries, and the extraction process is cheaper than if you do that in a quarry. So that's why a lot of sand is coming now from the marine environments. The sand is a special material that is act like a solid, but also as a liquid. If you take a handful of sand, it will flow between your finger. So when you create a hole when you're dredging sand in the marine environment, if it's too close from the shore, then the sand will slide down to compensate that gap, and it will erode the shorelines. Or even, as we've seen in Indonesia, they took it offshore, small inhabited islands that were made of sand, and those islands just disappeared because the sand flew in the direction of those gaps.
Indonesia's loss of the island led to diplomatic turmoil in the region. The extracted sand was sold to Singapore because the city-state wanted to expand its territory. A lucrative business for the neighboring states, but at the cost of the shallow Southeast Asian Sea, which was so serious that sand exports have since been stopped. We see the ecological consequences of maritime sand mining worldwide. This, combined with sea level rise and intensive coastal development, results in an unfavorable mixture. We have also changed the enormous sand cycle of the oceans as well as that of the large river systems.
Sand is the best coastal protection because it reacts dynamically. What nature does all by itself, it moves the sand from the beaches to the coastal area where we have the so-called sand reefs and raises these sand reefs. Then we don't have such big erosion problems during heavy storms. But if we take sand out of this system, then the sand can no longer react flexibly. It's not there. And then we get more and more problems on the coast.
According to the UN Environment Programme, 3 out of 4 beaches worldwide are endangered. To protect the coasts, sand is pumped up from the seabed and washed up on the beaches to fill in the cracks. It is also used to directly replenish beaches that are in danger of disappearing due to ocean currents. Like in the Maldives. Here, the government pours sand in to keep tourism going, because otherwise the island would sink into the sea.
And that's very well if you look at it in isolation. What we need to consider is that sand has to come from somewhere. So where is it coming from? It's coming from a site that was designated as an ocean biosphere. So we are actually destroying a biosphere in order to fortify this. Is that acceptable? I don't know.
On the Canary Islands, beaches are filled with sand from the Western Sahara, which is then gradually washed away again and needs to be replenished. That reassures the beach guests. For other organisms, however, foreign sand can even affect their gender.
I think one of the stories that really struck me and made me sit up and take notice was the fact that scientists in Florida, they found that really innocuous choices can have a tremendous impact. They found that just changing the type of sand changed the temperatures of the nests, turtle nests, right? And this had impacts on whether the nests hatched more females or males. It changed that.
What this means for the turtle population in the long term is still unclear. The rapid increase in sand consumption has led to ecological eruptions, so that now even the hungriest are trying to do something about it. Sandpits have been renaturalized in Europe for some time now. China has completely banned mining in some rivers. In the Baltic and North Sea, only a certain amount may be dredged in the sea. But what if there were no regulation and no cheating?
Illegal mining can take many different forms and shapes. It could be from people going in a little canoe to dig up the sand along, in the near shore. In China, for example, there were ships that really looked like normal ships, but they were actually ships that were illegally removing sand.
Morocco has already announced that 50% of the beaches have been cleared by simply sending trucks there every day with excavators to scoop up the sand and transport it away. This has incredible ecological as well as economic consequences.
However, illegal mining is not only problematic because it is illegal, but also because the consequences are often only discovered when it's too late.
You can have these huge holes in the ground that then fill up with water and they become breeding grounds for malaria mosquitoes, right? So it could be, or you could have livestock dying in those, or children who are playing and fall into these pits. And in Sri Lanka, for example, when sand mining started happening, groundwater tables were impacted. And so they had to walk much further away to fetch water for their daily lives.
You can make money quickly with sand, without investing a lot. Shovel, dig, sell. And the higher the profit prospects, the more likely it is that criminals with their own rules will emerge. Like in India, for example.
So the sand mafia is not one organization. These are highly territorial groups that have deep, deep connections within centers of power, basically. There have been many, many cases where people have been threatened for objecting to the sand being mined on their land. It could be journalists, it could be police officers, government officers on inspections or raids that are threatened. And if they don't back off, then sometimes they could be even killed.
Is time running out for sand? Global demand is far from being satisfied and the business remains lucrative. What solutions are there? The most obvious: use less sand and waste nothing. Or could we somehow make the largest sandpit in the world usable? Experiments are being carried out to add synthetic resin to desert sand to make it adhere better. Could that be the solution?
Do we really want to destroy the next ecosystem by mining the desert sand as well? I believe that ethically we don't want to and shouldn't do that. But instead perhaps think about how we can reduce our dependence on this sand or establish a recycling system so that we don't consume the quantities of sand that we have already extracted, but use it again and again.
Eben nicht verbrauchen, sondern immer wieder gebrauchen.
This means that before buildings are constructed, consideration should already be given to their subsequent dismantling.
Dann würden wir ein Gebäude eben nicht als linear.
Then we would not see a building as a linear process that dies at the end of its life, but would understand that we are building up a store of materials for the future, that future generations can draw on.
Bedienen können.
However, concrete of all things is not made for the raw material cycle. This is because its components, such as sand, are strongly bonded and cannot be broken back down into their pure form. Okay, at least construction waste would be used as recycled concrete. In Switzerland, the use of recycled concrete is even mandatory for public contracts. But does that really save sand?
What we are experiencing is that the supposedly ecological variant, recycled concrete, is very likely to lead to the scales going up. In other words, concrete is increasingly being used, again with a clear conscience.
So we need a better strategy to protect sand. A world without concrete? But what will become of the buildings that the concrete age brought forth in the first place? Around 80% of the world's population does not live in high-rise buildings, rather in dwellings with a maximum of 2 stories. And even thousands of years ago, they didn't need concrete. Rather wood, clay, straw, hemp or bamboo. And there is something else.
Wir kamen auf die Frage,
We came up with the question of how we could ultimately replace cement as an adhesive or binding agent, and came across the mushroom mycelium. The root system forms a very, very dense and interwoven system that can dissipate compressive forces very well.
System, das sehr gut Druckkräfte ableiten kann.
The mycelium can be used to bind grasses or wood particles so tightly that a pressure-resistant building material is created, making sand superfluous as a binding agent. Another idea, from the University of Geneva, uses so-called ore sand as construction sand. In a way, ore sands are waste that is produced during ore extraction. 30 to 60 billion tons per year. One of the world's largest waste streams could finally find a good use. Even if such and other alternatives already exist, concrete, and therefore sand, is still the world's most important building material. And there are 2 main reasons for this. Sand is inexpensive and can be extracted without much know-how. But what if sand were less attractive? If the price were to be adjusted a little, could the price crew be turned a little?
Today, when they mine sand, they don't pay any taxes for this sand, for the material itself.
So if you start to put a price through taxes or through licensing the area where you're extracting sand, you give a value to this material, and then people get much wiser about the use of it.
Denmark already levies taxes on the extraction of sea sand. And lo and behold, consumption is falling.
People are losing lives based on this resource that so many of us take for granted. So it's a really, really fundamental resource. We cannot afford to ignore it. The UNEP says that it should be treated as a strategic resource. It's a resource that really needs to be managed carefully.
This could be achieved through global sand monitoring, which not only registers the extraction of sand, but also monitors the effects. And through establishing rules for extraction, the United Nations is currently trying to do this. The global view of the small grain, so to speak.
I think gradually the countries realize that there is a topic here that was overlooked. It's still early enough that we can do something, but we have to act very quickly.
Mankind is beginning to understand the value of these small grains. Sand is like other resources on our planet. It takes a long time to produce, but is consumed much more quickly. But we don't have to bury our heads in the sand just yet. We have the chance to protect this resource appropriately.